I never thought that a short vacation on the beach could change everything. A wave that washed away trust, leaving an irreparable rift in our marriage. The night sky was filled with stars. The sea reflected the faint moonlight, creating a mysterious picture that was both peaceful and strange. The waves lapped against this, and as if whispering the secrets of the ocean's secrets that perhaps I myself would soon become a part of, the sea breeze blew by, causing the hem of my dress to flutter, carrying a gentle chill that I was not sure whether it came from nature or from my own heart. Caleb, the man I had been with for more than 25 years, was the one who planned this trip he had always loved. The ocean always said that only the ocean made him feel truly free. I used to think in the first years of our marriage that I was the one who brought that feeling of freedom to him. But as time passed, I gradually realized that I was just a small boat in his sea, drifting aimless, and perhaps no longer the destination he wanted. Joining us were Ryan and Jake, two of Caleb's close friends. They were experienced, free-spirited men with adventurous stories that made the evenings around the campfire more lively. But tonight, amid the crackling fire and the sparkling glasses of wine under the moonlight, there was something different in there, an invisible tension and undercurrent, waiting to erupt when the fire was at its brightest. Caleb leaned back, raised his glass of wine and smiled. That smile was what made me love him, a smile full of confidence, a little mischievous and somehow unpredictable. "Let's change our sleeping places tonight for something different," he said, his eyes sparkling with challenge. I laughed, thinking it was just a harmless joke, but as my eyes swept over Ryan and Jake's faces, a chill ran down my spine. No one objected, no one was surprised. They just looked at each other, as if they had been waiting for this moment. I looked at Caleb, searching his eyes for an explanation, but he just took a sip of his drink as if this were completely normal. The waves still lapped the shore, a haunting rhythm that foreshadowed an approaching storm. Little did I know that tonight's decision would take me to the edge of temptation, where the waves would not only wash away footprints in the sand, but also the fragile boundaries between right and wrong. The cool night breezes swirled around me, but it didn't wake me. Up on the contrary, it made me feel like I was drifting into a strange dream, a dream that I didn't know where it was leading me. Caleb stood, upstretching as if the offer to switch tents was a trivial matter. He patted Ryan on the shoulder, laughing, "I'll sleep in your tent tonight." Ryan smiled, shrugging in agreement, as if this was all too familiar. Only Istil, sitting there, felt something unsettling, creeping into every crack of this seemingly harmless dinner. Jake sat on the other side of the fire, saying nothing. He just looked at me with a calm gaze, the firelight reflecting in his deep eyes. It was not the innocent gaze of a normal friend. It was the gaze of a man who had seen through my precariousness, and perhaps I saw danger in him too. Caleb smiled excitedly, as if he were enjoying the game he had created. "Well, good night, everyone," he said casually. But I couldn't ignore the strangeness in that smile. As Caleb and Ryan walked toward their tents, Jake and I sat alone by the dying fire. The space suddenly became eerily quiet. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to fight off the cold. But perhaps I was fighting off something even scarier. "I don't mind if you find our tent too cold," Jake said, his voice warm but not forceful. He said it like it was a polite invitation, but I could sense something behind it. I pursed my lips, glancing toward Caleb's tent. From here I could see the dim light coming from inside the silhouettes of two men moving. Caleb didn't look back at me. I tried to reassure myself this was just a simple situation. There was nothing wrong with sleeping in someone else's tent, right? But why did I feel like I was about to step into a dangerous situation? "I'll be fine," I said, but my voice wasn't entirely certain. Jake didn't say anything more. He just nodded, his eyes still on me, as if he were assessing something. Then he stood up and walked back to his tent, leaving me alone by the fire. I sat there while trying to convince myself that I wasn't, wavering, but with each passing minute, each gust of cold wind, I felt myself losing control. The cold night at sea was brutal. I wrapped my jacket tightly around me, but it wasn't enough. My body shivered and it ached. Stronger wind blew through, making me shiver. I looked toward Jake's tent. If I just stepped inside, I would be warm. I wouldn't have to shiver anymore. But I also knew that once I did, I would never be the same person. Again, I took a deep breath. My mind told me to get up, walk straight to my tent and not look back. But my heart, or perhaps the loneliness that had accumulated over the years, whispered something else. I stood slowly, my feet on the soft sand. Not a sound, echoed only the distant sound of the ocean. Waves like a never-ending melody I didn't dare look towards. Caleb's tent, when I unzipped Jake's tent and climbed in, the warmth enveloped me. Immediately Jake wasn't asleep yet, was lying on his side facing me. But as soon as I entered, he moved away, a little leaving space. Between us there was a long silence. I felt my heart pounding, my breathing becoming heavier. Jake didn't say anything, but I could feel his presence so close that if I reached out, I could touch him. "You don't have to do anything, just warm up," he said softly. But I heard something else in his voice, an expectation, an unspoken invitation. I looked at him in the dim light. I saw his face clearly strong, calm, but with a tension that I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what would happen next, but I did know tonight I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The silence in the tent was suffocating. The waves outside were still pounding steadily against the sand. But inside, everything seemed to have stopped. I could hear my heart pounding, each beat like a drumbeat in my mind, reminding me that I was facing a decision that could change everything. Jake was only a small distance away, but I could feel his warmth, a different kind of warmth than the campfire outside, different from the blanket I wrapped myself in on cold nights. This warmth carried life, a strong presence that I couldn't ignore. He didn't look at me, but I knew he was aware of my presence right next. Tom, I pulled the blanket over me, trying to steady my breathing. Just a touch, and everything could spiral out of control. If I moved just a little closer, I would break every boundary I had maintained for over 25 years. I closed my eyes, trying to clear my head of the crazy thoughts, but in the silence, I remembered all the lonely moments I had experienced. I remembered the dinner salon when Caleb worked late. I remembered the times he lay next to me without touching me. I remembered the feeling of a woman longing for love, for attention, but only receiving endless emptiness in return. And now in this moment, there was a man right in front of me, someone who brought a warmth that I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know when I moved, but when I opened my eyes, I realized that the distance between me and Jake had shortened. I saw his shoulders tense slightly, as if he was waiting for something. A strong wind blew through, making the tent shake slightly. In that moment, I felt like the world was just me and Jake, separated from reality by the thin fabric of the tent. Slowly raised my hand, my fingers brushing the fabric of his arm, a fleeting gesture, but one that carried 1,000 meanings. Jake turned his head to look at me. His eyes were dark, as deep as the ocean. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke, but I knew we both understood that the boundary had been broken. He didn't ask. I didn't need to say. Amidst the sound of the waves and the heavy breathing, I knew I had made a choice. I woke up as the first light of dawn crept through the tent fabric. The first feeling I felt was not happiness, no satisfaction, but an undercurrent of confusion and guilt. I turned my head to look beside me. Jake was still sleeping, his breathing, even his face, strangely peaceful, but I didn't feel peaceful. I gently pulled the blanket back and stepped out of of the tent. The sand beneath my feet was colder than I expected, as if to remind me that last night had not been a dream. I looked out to see where the sun was slowly rising over the horizon. The soft, golden light spread across the water heartbreakingly. Beautiful, but inside me a storm was brewing in the distance. I saw Caleb standing alone. His eyes turned to the sea. He didn't turn around, but I had the feeling he knew I was there. Don't know if he noticed anything different. But when he turned to look at me, there was something in his eyes that made my heart clench. He smiled. It was a normal smile, but I couldn't read what it meant. "How do you feel about this trip?" hesked his voice, light and casual. I tried to smile. "Wonderful," but my voice wasn't as sure. As before, Caleb looked at me for a long moment, as if considering something. Then he nodded, turned away, and continued looking out too. See, everything seemed normal, but I knew something had changed. Jake stepped out of the tent after me, his eyes sweeping over me, but not lingering, not a word. Not a confirmation we had crossed a line, from which there was no turning back, and I didn't know where the next wave would take him as the sun rose higher. Casting a golden glow over the sand, everything seemed normal, but I felt like every look, every gesture around me carried hidden messages that I couldn't decipher. Breakfast was quieter than I expected. Ryan stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze wandering out to sea, but I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. Jake sat across from, taking a bite of toast, but not looking directly at me once, and Caleb, he was still smiling, still talking as if nothing was different. But I knew my husband better than anyone. I saw the gaps in his gaze, the moments when the smile on his lips didn't quite reach his eyes. Hick knew I wasn't sure how much he knew, but I could feel it in the way he held my gaze, longer than usual, in the way he picked up his coffee and didn't drink it right away, just swirled it in his hand, a stronger sieb. Breeze blew. Through shaking the glass on the table, I tightened my grip around my coffee cup to steady myself. "Did you sleep well last night?" Caleb spoke suddenly, his voice calm, but I felt like I had been stripped naked in the daylight. Jake paused for a moment as he cut into the egg on his plate, but he quickly continued as if nothing had happened. I smiled, trying to control my voice. "Yeah, the sea breeze made me a little chilly at first, but then I was fine." Caleb raised an eyebrow, a smile playing on his lips. I thought, "You would be cold." He put down his coffee cup, his eyes fixed on mine, a slow, calculating look, a look that made me feel like he was waiting for me to confess something. I tightened my hand around my spoon. In that moment, I knew that Caleb was not a man to be trifled with. Ryan suddenly broke the silence. "Any plans today? Maybe a little sailing?" He turned to look at Ryan. Was he deliberately changing the subject, or was I imagining it? Caleb leaned back in his chair, still not taking his eyes off me. "Sail sounds good," he said, his voice slow, a little change, a little challenge. "What do you think I felt like?" I was standing on a thin wire. Jake took a sip of coffee, nodded slightly, lead the way, and so we boarded the boat. The sea was more beautiful than usual today. Waves gently lapped against each other in the sunlight. A peaceful dance. But I knew the sea had its secrets, undercurrents, that the naked eye couldn't see. Waves that seemed calm, but could wash everything away in the blink of an eye. I sat at the bow of the boat, my hands gripping the wooden edge, letting the seawater splash against my skin. Jake sat a few feet away, his eyes on the horizon, but I could feel the tension in his every move. Caleb stood behind me, his hands on the wheel, steering the boat with an air of calmness that seemed like he had done this 1,000 times before, but I could sense something different about him, a deliberate calm, a control that I couldn't quite place. "The water is deep here," Caleb said, his voice drowning out the wind. I turned to look at him. His eyes held a strange glint. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice. Even Caleb shrugged, a smile playing on his lips. "It's just the truth. There are places where once you fall, There's no turning back that made me feel like I'd been pushed to the edge of a cliff. Ryan laughed. But his laugh sounded fake. Come on. We're having fun. Don't take it so seriously. But Caleb didn't take his eyes off me. I turned back, trying to focus on the horizon, but I knew this was more than just a normal trip. I knew I was being tested. I knew Caleb was waiting to see if I'd expose myself. I clenched my fist and took a deep breath. The waves were still gently lapping at the hull, but I felt like he was in the middle of a storm that was about to tow it, and I didn't know which of us would be swept away when the storm finally did. The trip took longer than I expected. The sun was high in the sky, its rays reflecting off the water, sparkling like a million shards of a giant mirror, beautiful as the view. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hemmed in. Caleb wasn't as talkative as he had been at breakfast. He was focused on steering, but I knew he was watching everything. Every glance, every breath, every pause. Between Jake and me, Ryan was different. Too, he kept glancing between Caleb and me, as if he knew something was going on, but wasn't sure what his role was in it. Jake, he was quiet. Unlike the previous times when we'd talked freely, he barely said a word. I knew he was trying to avoid drawing attention, but that just made it all the more unusual. I could feel the undercurrent between us growing more dangerous than ever. Do you guys want to go swimming? Caleb suddenly said, breaking the tension. I looked at him, startled. Swim, he nodded, his eyes shining in. The sunlight. Yeah, the water here is clear. Don't you want to try? I glanced down at the deep blue sea beneath the placid surface. I had no idea what awaited me. Ryan laughed. That's a good idea. Caleb, it's hot. Anyway. Jake looked at Caleb for a long moment, then slowly stood up. I'm not swimming. His voice was strangely low. Caleb didn't look at Jake, just smiled. What about you? Honey, I knew this wasn't just an invitation, was a test. I had a feeling that if I refused, he would know for sure what I was trying to hide, but if I agreed, I would be putting myself in a situation I couldn't control. Okay? I tried to keep my voice casual. I took off my jacket, leaving my swimsuit underneath. Jake didn't look at me, but I could see his arms clenched into fists. Caleb chuckled good. He dove into the water first, the water splashing around him. Ryan followed, laughing as he dove for a moment before surfacing again. I stood at the edge of the boat, taking a deep breath. Be careful. Jake's voice was soft enough for me to hear. I didn't turn to look at him. I knew if I did, I would reveal what I was trying to hide. I dove in. The water was colder than I expected, but the feeling didn't last long. It floated to the surface, gasping for air. Caleb was nearby, his eyes glued to me. How's that, he asked. I nodded. Great, Caleb Lord. Sometimes a change is nice, right? I sensed that was about more than just swimming. Ryan swam away, oblivious to the conversation, but Caleb didn't take his eyes off me. Then he suddenly swam closer, so close that I could feel the steam on my skin from his movements. Do you have anything to say to me? He asked, his voice so soft it was scary. Stiff-end, what do you mean? Caleb tilted his head as if considering his answer. It's just that I feel something has changed. I opened my mouth to deny it, but then Jake spoke. From the boat, we should go back. The waves are starting to get bigger. I turned my head, realizing that the wind had indeed picked up. The small ripples were turning into larger waves. Caleb watched me for a moment, then chuckled. Yeah, let's go back. We climbed into the boat, and when I stepped onto the deck, Jake was suddenly standing very close. Tom, are you okay? He asked, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. He nodded. I'm fine, but I knew I was lying. The unspoken confession. That evening when we returned, the tent, Caleb still had that familiar smile on his face. He didn't say anything about what had happened on the boat, but I could feel it hanging between us as I entered my tent. I heard Caleb close the flap behind me. Good night, baby, he said. But there was something in his voice that I couldn't place. I lay down and closed my eyes, trying to lull myself to sleep, but I knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. And when I turned, I saw Jake standing in the distance, looking at me through the moonlight. We didn't speak, but in that look, I knew we were both caught in this undertow, and no one knew who would be swept away. First, thank you for taking the time to listen to our story. We appreciate your support, but again, this is just a fictional story, not based on real events. However, we hope this story has brought you moments of suspense and reflection. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channels, or you don't miss the next dramatic stories. If there is anything that makes you unsatisfied, leave a comment. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video to discuss with your friends. If they were the main character, what would they choose?